Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to make a few announcements and just outline the structure of our day. In terms of announcements, there are copies of Dr. Malhotra's book, Being Different, at the back, which you may purchase if you like for $25. And I've also been asked to request that you sign. There's a sheet in the back. If you'd like to sign up with your names and your email addresses, the people who were involved in the organizing of this conference would be most happy about that. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Rajiv Malhotra, who's going to speak to us on the topic, The Challenge to Western Universalism, an Indian Response. Dr. Malhotra is the founder and president of Infinity Foundation. He's an Indian-American entrepreneur, philanthropist, and community leader who has devoted himself for the last 10 years to clarifying the many misperceptions about Indic traditions in America and amongst Indians. He's an active writer, columnist, and speaker on a variety of topics, including the traditions and cultures of India, the Indian diaspora, globalization, and East-West relations. And he will speak to us. And when he is done with his talk, we have two speakers who will respond to him, and I will introduce them at the time. They will speak for approximately 15, maximum 20 minutes, and then we'll take a break. We'll take a very short break of about 5 minutes. You can have a coffee and biscuits or whatever, stretch your legs, and then we'll resume for a question period. And the question period will last until 3 when we will close the event. And I will share that. So looking forward to Dr. Malhotra, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this event. I look forward to interesting discussion. I'd like to begin by giving you a little background as to how and why I wrote this book. There's a multiplicity of streams of thinking and influence that culminated in this book. A lot of people, when I was writing this book, said, why don't you write a book on being same rather than being different? And I think that's one of the issues I wanted to discuss in the book. The preference that we human beings have, all of us, the more comfort we have when we are with people who are same. Whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's religion, whether it's language or whatever, people prefer sameness. That's why you have groups there of similar people. But I wanted to talk about what's less often talked about, which is difference. Of course, things are not entirely different, just like they're not entirely the same. And two entities can have many aspects that are the same, but they can also have many aspects that are different. I'm told by biologists that the genome of many animals like the apes is largely the same as humans, but we wouldn't want to think of ourselves as the same as them. So the differences are extremely significant in many ways, and they seem to be part of the fabric of reality. It's not just cultural, but the reality of the cosmos is built on differences. So I wanted to explore differences from the point of view of Western universalism having become a sort of de facto standard of sameness, or a de facto gold standard of something to aspire to be part of the melting pot, or something to imitate, or something against which others are evaluated. By Western universalism, I mean the experience of Europe and then extended to the United States and Canada, of a certain history, a certain philosophy, certain circumstances which had to be dealt with by upheavals and changes. So a certain ideology and worldview that emerged as a result of that particular experience is what I refer to as Western universalism. it would have been just Western particularism, like any other particularism, had it not been the one that spread more successfully around the world due to colonization, due to language, due to economic dominance, due to media. So partly the West had a program to expand its way of thinking. There was a Christian version for evangelical expansion and an Enlightenment version for its spread. And partly it was also people from the other countries wanting to pull it in as a way to boost their own status. So I find a lot of Indians really, in India, really obsessed with Western Universalism to sort of prove themselves. And this is, it's easier to talk about Western Universalism to Westerners. I found a lot of Westerners who will say that, okay, you know, we understand that there are other points of view. The Chinese are claiming a Confucian Universalism. They are claiming a Confucian ethic and a Confucian modernity. There is an Islamic Universalism which is claiming its worldview, not only relationship with God, but organization of society, finance, personal life, and so on. So when I talk about Western Universalism, I find that a lot of Westernized Indians, which is the power elite in places like Delhi, are very uncomfortable about it because they're so invested in a certain trajectory. They've joined a certain kind of a mobilization. They're judging their success based on how much they are into Western Universalism. That here comes a person who sort of makes themselves conscious of it all of a sudden. So I find a lot of critique and a lot of discomfort coming from upper strata, westernized, well-placed Indians. And this is, I think, an important, thank you. This, I think, is an important point, that Western Universalism as a worldview is not the same thing as Westerners as people. Because I know a lot of Westerners who have distanced themselves from this Western Universalism. I mean, there are a lot of Westerners who are embracing some other worldview, just like there are a lot of Indians embracing the Western Universalism as their worldview. So when I talk about differences of civilizations, it's not the same as differences. It does not apply to people based on birth, because there's people born with Western ancestry who are not following that particular ideal or that particular universalism. Just wanted to clarify that. There's a tradition in India called the Purva Paksha, which was the standard discourse methodology for a critique of the other. And this was very popular debate between Vedantins and Buddhists and different schools of Vedanta among each other. So because of the Purva Paksha, there was always everybody gazing at everybody else. So the Buddhist gazing at the Vedantin, Vedantin gazing at the Buddhist, and different schools gazing at each other, and each trying to understand the other on their terms, understand them on one's own terms, give a response called Siddhanta, your own response. Now, somehow, one of the things that intrigued me and led me to write this book is that the Purva Paksha tradition somehow did not get applied to Western thought. It's very interesting. I go to a lot of swamis, acharyas, a lot of scholars. I made this point in an address, special panel at the World Sanskrit Congress in Delhi, which had about 2,000 people. And I've gone to many prominent spiritual organizations. And I've asked, why isn't there in your organization, in the study of Dharma, why isn't there a comparative study of the West from your point of view? And I get interesting answers. I get answers like, the truth is with us, why do we need to worry about others? This kind of an answer. And I say, aha, but during the classical times, Adi Shankara was debating the Buddhists. He wasn't saying truth is with me, so why do I need to debate them? He was debating Buddhists. And then the magic word is Purva Paksha, because they all know what that means. So I say, well, there was Purva Paksha. And they say, yeah, that is true. So I say, well, then why not do Purva Paksha of Islam and Purva Paksha of Christianity and Purva Paksha of Hegel and Enlightenment and postmodernism and Marxism? Why not? And they really don't have an answer. That's the bottom line. They really do not have an answer. And most of them come to me and say, that's absolutely correct. This is an issue. We need to start that. And so in various universities and various intellectual centers, there is interest that we should come to get together a group. In fact, a very important place in India, Center of Learning, wants me to set up something on Skype with Westerners in the West to use video conferencing and have this debate in Purva Paksha to kind of get them going. So this is of interest. One of the areas I'm researching, which will show up in some books I hope to write very quickly, finish very quickly, has to do with Westerners who spend many years journeying out of their tradition into Hinduism or Buddhism. Many. People into yoga, meditation, people get, they join ISKCON. Some of them stay forever. And that's not the person of interest I'm referring to. I'm referring to the person of interest who, after spending 10, 20, 30 years, wants to come back to their original identity. So I wanted to find out what made them bounce back. I call this the U-turn. What was unacceptable? What was the threshold they couldn't cross? Where was the boundary? What were the factors? So I went and did a lot of interaction with such people, a lot of surveys. Just a month ago I was in Pondicherry, which, as you know, is a center for Sri Aurobindo's studies. And after my talk, a woman who identified herself as a German stood up and said, I'm a German. I've been in the Sri Aurobindo movement for like 25 or more years. And just last year I went back to Germany and got myself baptized. So I would like to tell my story. I said, perfect. We have it all right here on camera. Let's hear her story. So she explained her story of why, after being so deeply immersed in Sri Aurobindo's teachings, she wanted to go back and reclaim her Christian identity. It was a very interesting story, and I have hundreds of such case studies. So I wanted to find out what's behind all this, just to understand it. Because, and some of the stuff I uncovered shows that there may be certain differences that are irreconcilable, and you have to make a choice. And those differences are such that you cannot just digest that part of dharma into your Western identity. You have to either sort of discard that and reclaim your Western identity and solidify around the Western identity, or you have to sort of almost give up, surrender your Western identity in order to go all the way into the dharma. T.S. Eliot has a experience like that, and he writes about this, and it's something written in a couple of books. He, at one point when he was studying Sanskrit, he says that this philosophy, this profound philosophy of the classical Sanskrit is so great that it makes European philosophers look like schoolboys. That's what his statement is. And then he's contemplating going deeper into it, and even toys with the idea of moving to India and just permanently going there. And he says, to really get deeper into this and benefit from it further, I have to let go of who I am. And that's the moment when, a little bit later in his diary, he writes that to go further into this journey, into the Sanskrit classics, I will no longer be able to be an Englishman. And then he decides that he will stay who he is. And he gets baptized, middle-aged guy in the Boston area, public baptism, which is kind of unusual. To be baptized as a child is normal, but to be baptized one more time, it's almost like I want to make the point, I want to fortify myself with this, make sure I'm secure in my Christianity. So this German lady might have had some similar kind of an experience. So I wanted to understand what are the differences that are non-digestible. Certain differences are digestible. So in India, in the church, they'll take the shoes out, they'll remove the shoes, they'll wear saffron, the priest will wear, they'll have agarbatti, incense, they'll have flowers, garlanding, Mary, They'll sit cross-legged on the floor. So there's a lot of differences that can be bridged through inculturation. But the question I always ask is, how far can you keep going before you have to stop for some reason? And that's the U-turn point, and that's the point of difference I'm trying to identify in this. What are the non-digestible, irreconcilable differences, so I can understand them better. We can define things better that way. And so I find that another interesting thing I discovered in this journey of mine was that there's a lot of appropriation from Greek thought into Christianity and into the West. But that's not denied. There's no reason to replace it with a European equivalent and erase Greece out of it. In fact, it is fashionable. In fact, it is considered a sign of being a very learned person to quote Plato and to quote Aristotle and to be able to say that I'm well read in all those things. And it's a sign of being a very good intellectual Westerner to have that background. But the same is not true of the huge amount of appropriations from Indian dharmic sources. And this is why I'm writing these books on how the Indian dharmic sources have influenced, especially since the 1500s when the Jesuits came to India with the Portuguese, from that moment onwards, both through Buddhism and Hinduism, a huge amount of rethinking Christianity, reimagining Christianity, the idea of feminine, the idea of sacredness of the earth, the idea of mysticism, yoga, all sorts of these things, reimagining and bringing them into Christianity from Indian sources. But you don't find the teaching of Abhinav Gupta or Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti or Panini or Patanjali or Adi Shankara or Ramanuja, or you don't find the 100 great classical Indian thinkers to be on par with the Greek thinkers and part of the world classics. There is no world classics. There is a strictly Western classics, and the Indian classics taught in a little place we call religion or something, but it is not sort of mainstream. And so this also was one of the areas of interest that led me to this book. And then I looked at conferences on religion, both the AAR and conferences in Wisconsin, South Asian Studies, Berkeley. I went and got the last several decades of proceedings and had some graduate students look through all the conferences on Indian religions to see what are the topics and what is not covered and how is it framed, what are the categories used. And I found that it was typically a Western gaze at the other, using Western categories, using Western anthropological categories, Western theological categories, Western normative ideas of what to look for was generally the case, but of course there are exceptions. And I felt it would be interesting to reverse the gaze, and maybe a dharmic anthropology of the West would be probably an interesting exercise. So in this book I run the risk, which I try to avoid, but there is a tendency for me to, in order to make the point of difference, in order to emphasize the point of difference, it may come across like those differences are absolute and essential, essences which they are not intended to be. It may sometimes seem like I don't think there is anything same, but there obviously is a lot same. It's just that that's not the focus of my book. I'm trying to exaggerate or emphasize the differences to explain those differences for this purpose, but I do realize that there's a lot of things that are the same. I realize that there are Western mystics, Christians mystics, Jewish mystics, but in the book I also explain some of the differences between mysticism in the Western tradition and mysticism in the Indian tradition. For one thing, the Christian mystics were not valorized as much as they were in India, and often they were looked at with suspicion, sometimes they were even persecuted. So they didn't develop the same lineages. They didn't develop the same lineages as they did in the Hindu-Buddhist traditions. In particular, a big difference I look at is the role of history. I call it history centrism, which means that some extraordinary, unique, absolute event happens in history, which is not going to happen again, which never happened prior to that or subsequent to that. And that becomes a kind of an absolute. It becomes an axiomatic, universal. You have to subscribe to that. So you could be the mystic all you want, but unless you subscribe to that particular historical event, it's only going to take you up to a point. Whereas in the Indian tradition, there is historicity, but people will also tell you, well, if you don't happen to know all of that, and you don't happen to subscribe to all of that, but you just go within in your own journey, and you do the right things, you'll also be okay, and you'll also get to the same place of moksha. Buddha, in fact, makes it very clear that he's not the first, he's not the last, there's nothing about him that others can't have, others can't be. And the same is true of the rishis in general. So I wanted to find out if one looks at people like Ramon Panikkar, the great Jesuit theologian who died just a few years ago. I've read him in great detail and found that quite inspiring. He was on a similar track, looking at the same kind of questions that I'm looking at, the questions of difference and what is similar between the Hindu and Christian tradition in particular. I wanted to find out how far could such thinkers go, and I've looked at several such thinkers. How far can they go before they cannot go any further? And I also looked at people like De Mello, a Sri Lankan Jesuit, who did go all the way. And he did try to bring all of Vedanta into Christianity. And the church made a ruling against him and banned his books and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to find out what are the non-negotiables in a given tradition, such that those are the sacrosanct axioms that you can't compromise. And the Nicene Creed, the role of the Nicene Creed as a history-centric axiom. And I've tried to compare the idea of karma, reincarnation, which is so pervasive in all the Dharma tradition. You know, one of the things that's common to no matter which Dharma tradition there is the idea of karma, reincarnation, and the nature of time. And I try to contrast these and compare them with the equivalent in Western religions and find that if you take either axiom, it falsifies the other. Not that one is right or other one is wrong, not that one is superior or inferior, because I cannot prove either one of them right or wrong, but they're incompatible. And that's what I'm trying to do, is show that there is an incompatibility, mutual incompatibility in these different things. So the purpose of this is to explain to our own spiritual leaders of the Dharma side what are some of the distinctive qualities that they should become conscious of. It's also to explain to Westerners who go into the Eastern spiritual journey as to what are the trade-offs that they'll make at some point in time, where they will have to either give up one or the other, but this business of being in both will at some point in time have a tension inside it. So I'm basically looking at this book, starting a series of conversations like this one. It's not a final or a conclusive or a kind of a position. It's a status report on where my journey has taken me this far, and I look forward to feedback and comments from others, and hope that this book succeeds in starting some discussions on what is similar, what is different, so that different civilizations can have more mutual understanding based on how the other side feels. Thank you very much, and I look forward to comments.
Thank you very much. Our first commentator today is Professor David Miller. He teaches in the departments of religious studies here at the University of Toronto, at Ryerson as well, and was professor at Concordia University from 1970 to the year 2000. From 1960 to 63, he did extensive research in India for his doctoral thesis on Hindu monasteries and monasticism, and published a book, Hindu Monastic Life, which was republished in 1996. He's done extensive research in India with a particular focus on Swami Shawanda research, and his main publications are in scholarly journals on gurus. So, Dr. Miller.
So, that was a marvelous, marvelous introduction, and I want to pick up on one thing that was said. Purva Paksha. Purva to me is one of the most important aspects of the book in sense, because Purva is something that I truly believe in, and that is to say, any individual such as myself, coming out of a Western background, my father was a Methodist, his father was a Methodist deacon. I went to Harvard University and became a humanist. But basically, I was deeply influenced when I went to India. I went to Bhubaneswar to study monasteries. I was one of the very first to go from the program in comparative religion at Harvard University. And the program promotes the idea to study the tradition in the culture in which that individual is, as it were, working, as opposed to doing translation of text, which was the traditional way that one looked at Hindu tradition or Hindu traditions back in that time. So I went about with a dhoti, a white dhoti, and a top, and on a bicycle, riding into the old part of Bhubaneswar. And would you believe the people there received me with grace? They had never seen anything like this before. No Britisher would go about in a dhoti, riding a bicycle in the old part of Bhubaneswar. So I was able to integrate, as it were, into Hindu monasteries that would have excluded me if I had gone in traditional Western dress. So I think there's a great deal to be said about Purva in terms of understanding the tradition, knowing that tradition within, and being able to articulate that. Now, in the terms of that we're talking about in terms of philosophical debate, that's what Sanskrit scholars, Buddhist scholars did. They would articulate the other tradition, the other argument of the opponent as objectively as possible. So that would be the starter, and the other would do the same. So we're talking about here is really something that occurs in this marvelous book, which is indeed a marvelous book. 350 pages of incredible material, really marvelous. Is that the idea of mutual respect? Now, mutual respect differentiates from tolerance. And too often we hear the word tolerance. You come to a multicultural event and the word tolerance is used. We must be tolerant to others. But the point he makes so clearly is that tolerance seems to imply from a point of view you're tolerant of people who are lesser than you. Mutual respect is what I feel is important in this text. Mutual respect means to say, you know that other tradition or other traditions from within. You're able to articulate it in ways that even a person within that tradition could articulate it. And you do so, as it were, as best as possible, learning from the dialogue, learning from the position of others. So I think that is a very crucial thing in terms of the methodology of this kind of presentation. The other thing, as I said, was Purva. In other words, learning as best one can that particular tradition. And I highly recommend, as I mentioned earlier, going to the culture of that particular tradition, learning that tradition from within, and then coming back, as it were, and teaching it, as opposed to studying the text. Now, there are those who do study the text, and I have had colleagues who study text as well. But I think there's a great deal of difference between the individual who goes to that culture and works within that culture and works with peoples in that culture, as opposed to the person who sits in some crowded study room full of books and simply reads about the other tradition, perhaps in Sanskrit or perhaps in some other Indian language. Now, I'll end by saying I was a very good friend of Gehananda Bharati. Does anybody know Gehananda Bharati? He was at Syracuse University. That man was fascinating. He was German-born, took the name Gehananda Bharati when he took ordination in India. He traveled about India, and his key book is Ochre Robe, describing the robe that we have here in the front seat, the orange robe. He was a fascinating man. He was a polyglot as well. He knew all the languages. I took him out to dinner once at an Indian restaurant in Montreal, and would you believe it, he could speak the actual dialogue of the Bengali owner of the restaurant, of which there are several dialogues in Bengali. So the type of work that is being done today, the book that we're looking at today, to me is extremely stimulating, is really important. Purva Paksha, and that you find in that text, he knows and has learned our traditions. Now it is up to us, too, to learn their traditions. Being different means to say, being different, learning the other tradition, and learning it from within, not just in some sort of study hall, but actually going to the culture that one is studying. Now, I say that knowing that, of course, it costs monies and so forth to travel, to live in India. But there are scholarships. I worked with the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute for many years, and there used to be programs by which they sent academics to India, and we need to have more of that today. We need to have absolutely more of that, and we need to have exchanges too. I was one at Concordia University who helped establish the first Hindu Studies chair in North America at Concordia University. What did I do? I went to the Indian community. I had speakers come. We did cultural classical dance. We arranged together, that is to say, I was a minor part of it. The Hindu communities raised $1 million. I wrote a grant to multiculturalism. We got another $1 million. So we established the first Hindu Studies chair in North America. And Krishna Shiva Raman of McMaster University was the first recipient of that chair, a very close friend of mine. So Hinduism was being taught, and I say Hinduism, really Hindu traditions, was being taught by a Hindu who was also highly knowledgeable of Western philosophy. In any case, I really do appreciate everything that you are doing, and I say Swamiji or Guruji, because that's who you are to me. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, David. Our final speaker is Professor Kurt Richardson. He is an honorary professor of theology at McMaster University in Hamilton. He's graduated with a doctorate in theology from the University of Basel and is a co-founder with Frank Clooney? Frank Clooney with the Comparative Theology Group of the American Academy of Religion. One of his specialties is interreligious theology, and he has published quite a bit in that area, and he's a colleague of ours here in the Toronto School of Theology.
Great appreciation, Rajiv, for your excellent book, and I'm looking forward to its discussion by the Hindu-Christian Dialogue Group in the American Academy of Religion next fall. It will be quite interesting, and I think a tribute to the importance of the volume. It's highly autobiographical, but it's intellectual rigor, it's systematic thinking, it's cross-cultural, and actually post-colonial methodology is quite advanced. So we need to take time to be challenged by the book. Some of the Indian colleagues here have already let me know that this book, in their eyes, is a game changer. So it's a little bit daunting to be trying to positively and also critically interact with a game-changing book. I titled my reflections on the book Notes from Malhotra's Cross-Cultural Journey. And I think that that's proved out as I've been listening today. But I'd also like to use another word that I think is quite important, particularly in terms of our own critical discourse in the West, our own research interests, larger research interests, and that's the term pedagogy. This is a work of pedagogy. He is a very gifted teacher, and his penetrating discursive thought rarely lags, rarely gets off track from what is obvious from the front end, a pedagogical project. It is autobiographical, but it is worthy of our attention because he is such a good teacher. Now, we want to perhaps, however, be a little considerate of what pedagogy has come to mean to many of us. It's a major research field today in philosophy, in culture studies. It isn't so that you don't just have ideas in a library, but it is the embodiment of ideas and their transformation and reception, the migration of ideas, and the creation of ideas, the hybridity of ideas, and so on. Everything that Rajiv has been talking about today. So sometimes the word pedagogy is viewed in a kind of boring institutional way. And maybe that's the transmission part. But there is also a profoundly critical part. This is a major work in post-colonial critical thinking. And then finally, the most challenging part of pedagogy is reimagining. Every generation reimagines its relationship to the sources, whether the Indian canon or the Western canon. Actually, there are many, probably Indian canons, many Western canons. So what I want to do is just run down a number of points that are particularly generative for me from Rajiv's excellent book. Also critically interact at some points, because that's what this is about. A good debate that we mutually learn from out of profound mutual respect. Probably all of us are here because something in us adores Indian cultures on their own terms. So, just let me state that joy right out front. It was a shock, however, if you love Indian culture, you love Indian food, but it was a shock for me later in my adult life to find out that most of the time I was not eating Hindi Indian food. When I was eating chicken and beef and goat, I was eating more Muslim Indian food. And this was this was a game changer in a way. Because something which is not in the book is, of course, much longer than Western colonialization was Muslim colonial and Persian colonialization of India, which India is, as it writes some of its counter histories and new histories, Hindutva people, non-Hindutva people, there are trying to quickly write a history, however, is a daunting task, because the most immediate colonial threat or colonial influence or colonial challenge or colonial dystopia was with Westerners and the British and the Raj and all of that. But what do we think about the other, the Muslim other? One of the names that I love too, that figures prominently as a subtext in this book, perhaps the great, certainly one of, if not the great teacher of Rajiv, that seems to come out in the book to me, and that is the personage of Sri Aurobindo. From front to back, he is appearing in this book. I have a very special place in my heart for him because my favorite professor of philosophy of religion was a student of his work. He had learned Sanskrit. He had done all his doctoral research in India, in Pondicherry, and talked about and used Aurobindo as a global philosopher. But there's a problematic. Not a whole lot of Indians want to talk so positively about Aurobindo. He was a revolutionary. He was an intense nationalist of a kind that became very unpopular, both, now obviously to the Raj, but also to a lot of Indian intellectuals. He had his own late life or midlife return that Rajiv spoke about. Very interesting. I immediately think of Heidegger's word, kehre, turning. You journey into the woods, and you go as far as you want to go, onto a new track, Frost's road less traveled, perhaps. Maybe you have a knapsack, maybe you have provisions, maybe you have the desire, the lust to go across many borders. But at some point in your journey, after you've seen many things you didn't know were out there, and you've done it again and again, or you went further and further, one day you say, I'm going back home. And you turn around, and your personal journey is over. You go back home, and you settle more deeply into home than you ever thought possible. You did it because you were not going to settle at the end of your path. You were going to resettle at home. Now, not all of us do that, but many, in my experience, many do. So I just thought I would drop that out there. Aurobindo did that when he went from Ghosh to Sri. And he embodied Indian mystical wisdom as few in the 20th century embodied it. And even in that way, he kind of got in trouble. There were things about his creativity, his genius, but isn't that true of all great, creative, genius people? Why? Because there is no way to do your own personal journey, no matter how many people, no matter how well institutionalized your context might be, you can't do it without reimagining. You're going to reimagine. And so that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to as Rajiv himself evolves. As I evolve, as everyone in this room evolves, if you're willing to be conscious about it. We have interpenetrating cultures. We are trying to figure out what it means to, and I'm glad you mentioned various civilizations, what it means to reimagine Confucianism, what it means to reimagine Islam, and what it means to reimagine Indian religions. Another area that was sort of, nagging at me as I was reading the book, where does this, at least in one way or other, I asked myself, is this a neo-traditionalist book? And for me, neo-traditionalism in religion means that deep recovery of the grand traditions of a great religion, deep recovery. And so one is saying, where's the caste here, and which one, how does it work now, and so on. But at the same time, someone like our friend Frank Clooney, after spending, he's sort of the modern Robert D. Nobili, for sure, right? But he spent probably 2/3 now of his career deep in Sanskrit, and then moved over to Tamil. Well, what's that about? How do you interpret that? We don't know very many Tamil texts, let alone Tamil religion. We had this Brahmanic Jesuit thing going on, and what about that? And then, even more disturbingly, what about sort of democratically or populist inclined Dalit religion, neo-Dalit religion? And, so someone like Chandraban Prasad comes to mind. And his, up in Uttar Pradesh state, his English goddess temple. What about that? Where they're going to be dancing a different dance. They're going to be clothed in the ochre, but baby, they are going to be doing something very, very, very different. So, and this is Indian, profoundly Indian religion. I don't know how much more time I have. Okay. There was another sort of, You know, under the brilliant and, I think, universally, as you say, and I have a glancing blow of which universalism, right? How many universalisms? And there is a sense in which this pedagogy is an Indian universalism. Under that Purva Paksha, what I could call disputational respect, I'm also thinking about, of course, another Indian civilization, religion. And that is Buddhism of the first millennium of our era that didn't have a very easy time. As the more recent centuries developed, Hinduism adopted Buddha. And although the memory is in many Buddhist communities of Buddhist viharas usurped by Brahmins, many converted Hindu temples, you know, they have their own long history of complaints as Indian Buddhists. In many Puranic texts, Buddha is mentioned as one of the 10 avatars of Vishnu. And you have today significant Buddhist philosophical texts which will outline contra doctrine in terms of the appropriation of the Buddha and Buddhism in Hindu creeds. Let our Buddha be the Buddha. He is not Vishnu, and so on and so on and so on. Very interesting, very important. And it's part of a historiographical project that circumstances force on us. When you have monolithic culture, and I don't think we have it really anymore. We just, globally, we don't have it. But I have friends, I have dear, dear Roman Catholic friends, who choose to inhabit a medieval world. And if they have a public speaking opportunity, they want a neo-traditionalist pedagogy that will reconstruct an almost ahistorical metaphysic, an ahistorical history of its religion, which is a kind of bizarre oxymoron, an ahistorical history of our religion, so that we don't have to have the sacred history disturbed by rival historical accounts. The duties of judgment, the duties of collective humanity, of many different situations, underprivileged people, do they have human rights equality with everyone else? The people who are going to who ought to worry about that, or do worry about that, are the young intellectuals of India, probably most of them privileged, some of them by dint of their creativity and their attractiveness get elevated. One of the things that is kind of interesting, little quick quote from Chandraban Prasad. He is constantly reminding his community that Dalit men were once not allowed to wear the full-length version of the dhoti. And so he just decided to go over to modernity, Indian modernity, call it Western. I don't care, he says. English attire is what I want because it's caste neutral. In India, the dress of the people differs from caste to caste, but the architecture of the trouser is the same for everybody. Every guy looks like a good guy, a regular guy in pants, you know. And sometimes you have to be really practical. Now, of course, part of and I'll close with this, another little, for me, a little electric chord. When we have I haven't heard very many Hindu-Buddhist dialogues. Okay. We have Western Hindu dialogues. I haven't heard enough Muslim-Hindu dialogues. I haven't heard enough Confucian Hindu dialogues. But one of the dialogues that we have a very difficult time with is Christian-Buddhist. The Christian is viewed as militaristic, as violence-based culture. The Buddhist is viewed as pacifist and so on. And yet, you know, I have a little maxim. When every religion gets a state, if it was pacifistic, it ceases to be so. There are vast, vast passages in key Buddhist literature. For instance, the Seya Senapati Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, Book 5. There's just hundreds and hundreds of pages on how to do Buddhist militarism. All of the Buddhist principles are in place. An active soldier can't be a garbed monk, but all of the features of an aggressive, soldierly culture are there in Buddhism. And that's part of how they need to come clean. All of this is, I think, helped by a wonderful, wonderful colleague we have here at the University of Toronto, Professor Vincent Shen, who is the chair of Chinese philosophy and Eastern culture. One of his projects of what we're talking about, hermeneutics of culture. One of his terms, which I like very, very much, is the term strangification. The willingness of the thinker, of the scholar, of any person to walk out into the strange place, into the strange community, to them, and to allow that strangeness to transform them, to allow themselves to be transformed by it. What was described about, if I study any more Sanskrit, I will cease to be English. That was a great, great little line. And maybe each one of us, we know our own degree of transformation. It is transformative. We are all working now under conditions of reciprocal transformation.
Thank you for two very interesting responses. I really appreciate both sets of responses. Just to make just a few comments only, because then we'll go for coffee and have a lot of Q&A. The book, regarding the things I did not put in the book, which is what some of the things were, the Islamic colonization, you know, in the beginning I started writing about a comparison between Dharma and Abrahamic faiths, because then it's a family and a family, because they're both internally diverse. But then Islam is, a lot of the contrasts between Dharma and Western civilization don't map out to Islam so easily. So it's like, I would have to write a whole book on that. Islam is extremely similar to both in some ways. It's similar to the Abrahamic traditions when it's about history centrism. But then I have another chapter on order and chaos, comfort with what the Westerners call chaos, how that's very prevalent, that kind of a thing in India. And I started asking myself, but could I really apply that to Islam and say that they also have that thing or not? And it's both ways. So Islam is in some ways like the West, in some ways it is completely different from the West. And so then it would end up being a three-way comparison. Then this book of 400 some pages, 60 pages would end up being 1,000 pages. So I figured that the comparison with Islam is a separate project I should not get into. I also appreciate the remarks that there is a lot more interaction between cultures than just the one pair that I'm talking about. There's a lot of interaction between Hindu, Buddhist, which I didn't talk about, over centuries, and a lot of interaction between, with Dalits and things of that sort. And the reason I didn't is because each one of them is a huge study in its own right. And there are, in the AAR and other places, there are books and panels which already do that. But I hadn't come across a dharmic Purva Paksha of the West. I felt that was a gap needed to be done. And in some ways, it's a post-colonial critique, but the post-colonial scholars in India are so secularized, Western trained, that their critique of the West is a secular critique of the West. So it's a critique of the West using Western Siddhanta or Western theories. And even the postmodern critique of the West is not a dharmic critique. It doesn't stand on a platform of dharma and look at the West. It claims to stand nowhere. It claims to deconstruct everything. So, in fact, I have a section here differentiating my ideas from the postmodernists, because in postmodernism, since they don't have a positive, they don't take a positive dharmic view as theirs to look at the West. So the question is, after you've deconstructed the West, what's left? If you don't want to be nihilistic, what is left? Where do you stand? And it's not a clear answer from the postmodernist. So, and certainly I don't want to give the impression that a critique from the Dharma point of view therefore implies that Dharma's history and society and all of that is perfect or was perfect. I don't subscribe to that. I think there's a lot of imperfections, a lot of problems to be solved, and there always were. I don't think there was a golden era that we can go back to, or even if there was, that it could be possible to go back to. But I do think that adopting a viewpoint to look at another viewpoint enhances the discourse and enhances the knowledge. It's sort of like, an analogy I'll give is the feminist critique of gender and the critique of masculinity is not claiming that the female is perfect. It's just a point of view you adopt in order to get some more insight into gender. Especially if the masculine view had become the universal gaze, then you needed to step out of the universal gaze and be somewhere in order to take a look at it. So my technique of an assessment of Western universalism has to be from somewhere outside, and I therefore have to adopt a well-established, a long tradition with a lot of texts, a lot of resources, and that's the Dharma tradition I adopt. Not intending that it's a kind of an ideal or a permanent or a perfect tradition, and nor am I proposing a Dharma universalism as an alternative. People have asked me, what is your alternative to Western tradition? And I'm saying the book is silent on that. It's just a critique on Western universalism, but it doesn't say that therefore there is a Dharma universalism. That question would be a separate project in the future. So with that, I thank you very much for your comments, and we look forward to Q&A.
Thanks very much. So let's take a brief break and come back as soon as we can so we can have a maximum amount of time for comments and questions. Thank you.
You say Western view. So what do you mean by dharmic view?
I wanted to have something equivalent to the Abrahamic family of religions, because the Abrahamic family of religions has a lot of internal axiomatic similarities. They have differences, but they have similarities. So what would be the equivalent I call the dharmic family? And the dharmic family typically includes the different varieties of Hindu schools, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh. These are the dharmic varieties. These are the traditions that emerged out of India and use similar categories. So they understand, if you say Atman, they understand what you're talking about. They'll argue and disagree and all that, but they understand what you're talking about. So that was the intention of that term.
I think dharmic category is an excellent. Okay, is an excellent categorization. Much more so than Hinduism and Buddhism. When I teach, I often say there's no such thing as Hinduism or Buddhism. These are isms that have been placed by Westerners on Asian categories because they're basically traditions. And the beautiful thing is these traditions, as was brought out in this marvelous text, have never had warfare with each other. As you study, unfortunately, the problems that occurred in medieval Europe in terms of, as it were, Christian dominance. And he makes that point in the book, and I think it's a very, very good point. They're dharmic. They have a very base in terms of I would say, what he calls embodied learning. That is to say, the key in all those traditions is meditation and the experience that meditation gives. And it can be of the absolute one, a Brahman, or it could be in Buddhist tradition that everything is in constant change and flux, that there's nothing permanent. So there is a difference in the understanding of the meditational experience, but it's an embodied experience. And I think that's one of the more important points you make in your book, as opposed to history-centered.
Yes.